Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. It's my privilege to today to introduce the first of two lectures to be given by Professor Terry Eagleton. So from 2008 up until last summer, it was my still greater privilege to have Terry as a distinguished professorial colleague here in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster. Previously, Terry was John Edward Taylor Professor of Cultural Theory at the University of Manchester, and prior to that, the Thomas Wharton Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford. During his 13-year Lancaster years, Terry's given a score of tutorials to both postgraduates and undergraduates, and lectured on a host of topics, including terror and tragedy, Christ and communism, and Luther and Lenin. In so doing, Terry has indelibly written himself into the history of not only the department, but also alliteration. It makes perfect sense, therefore, that today, for his valedictory Lancaster lectures, his chosen topic should be heaven and hell. But this evening, it will be hell. First, we visit heaven. So friends, students and colleagues, Professor Terry Eagleton.
Back in Lancaster, after celebrating my 80th birthday, actually. I'll tell you what it's like to be 80, if you want to know. You're walking through an airport and you're pulling your suitcase, and you see a young woman whose face lights up when she sees you, and she comes rushing towards you, a dazzling smile, holds out her arm and takes your suitcase. That's what it's like to be 80. I can't begin without thanking John, who over the years has been my guide, counselor, tireless organizer, and dear friend. So he's set all this up all over all these years, and this is the last of the series. I suppose my only qualification really for talking about heaven is that I'm closer to it than any of you are. And I don't mean in virtue. Heaven is supposed to be, isn't it, about eternal bliss, eternal joy, a prospect which is, in a certain strange, perverse way, rather disconcerting. I find that prospect of eternal bliss rather disconcerting. It smacks of the terrors of the sublime, and it sounds rather inhuman. We're not really, mediocre beings that we are. We're not really up to eternal joy. And might prefer to trade it in, let's say for several centuries of keenly pleasurable sensations, or even, a series of delectable cups of tea. People might prefer that. The thought of paradise offends whatever it is in us which wants us to suffer, and which regards happiness as made in Hollywood. Indeed, the very word in English, happiness, has a sort of feeble ring to it, evoking as it does, red plastic noses and the image of a 90-year-old Cliff Richard cavorting around in a striped jacket. You can laugh occasionally if you feel like me. Better than the word happiness is Aristotle's word eudaimonia. So it sounds rather like a lung disease, but like eudaimonia, I suppose it's best translated as well-being. But even that has now been hijacked by the feel-good industry, hasn't it? Which has also, notice, replaced the curtly monosyllabic word health with the soft lilt of wellness. We can't even speak of health anymore. So maybe basking in eternal bliss is not for us. As Arthur C. Clarke said once, didn't he, that space is not for humanity. Whatever our fantasies and our illusions. So one can just imagine somebody yearning for the blessed oblivion of simply being left to rot, yes, screaming in terror as St. Peter tries to drag him through the pearly gates, like Faustus, with all the frenzy of Faustus trying to fight off Mephistopheles. It's a conceivable scenario, isn't it? Somebody who, for example, believes that he or she is elect, is part of those who are to be saved, but can't stand the thought and wishes they weren't. The phrase, the grammar of the phrase "going to heaven" makes it sound like going to Blackpool. I won't draw any other analogy. See people tediously, not Blackpool. That's not what I mean. Just the grammar of the phrase makes us think that, and as Wittgenstein keeps reminding us, we're continually being misled by grammar. Our grammar itself generates illusions. For example, it makes us imagine there are certain things, let's say the soul, which is rather like a kind of invisible pancreas sort of, yes, and it's our language, Wittgenstein says, that keeps trapping us into these fantasies. But if heaven means being with God, then that can't be right. Going to heaven can't be like going to Blackpool. Not only because God doesn't live in Blackpool, as far as I know, but he doesn't exist at any locatable spot at all, neither inside the universe nor outside the universe. Strange, isn't it, that when people talk about God, who of course we can refer to as her just as much as him, God is not gendered, people think she's somewhere in the sky, and they kind of point piously upwards. Well, why do they think God's in the sky? That's strange. Just kind of north of Saturn, or just in between, Jupiter. My astronomy is too bad for me to carry to end that sentence. But partly, I suppose, because it's hard for us to grasp the idea of something which isn't anywhere at all. Or which is everything, everywhere, all at once. I'm not just an egghead. Make any mistake about that. Which actually comes to much the same thing as not being anywhere at all, being everywhere. People say God is everywhere, partly, I think, to soften the scandal of not being anywhere, yes, of not being locatable. Everywhere we can kind of deal with in a certain way, but not being locatable in any one spot, that's sort of hard. To say that God is here and now, can't be to say that he's here in the way that you are here now. Because theological language is a stretch, stretches language like metaphor. It can't mean that God's here in the same way that that we are here, unless there's a old man with a white beard hiding. No. In fact, not only is that the case, I think that he's not here in the way that we're here, although it makes some kind of sense to say he's here, but we don't know what kind of sense that makes. Yes, theology is a kind of nonsense in a way. A serious, interesting, nonsense, but nevertheless. Not only that, but it's perfectly sound theology, I think, to say that God doesn't exist at all. God doesn't exist. When we speak of God existing, again, we're just stretching language. She isn't an entity or an object or a super object or an individual or even a person in the sense in which Dominic Raab is arguably a person. God can't be reckoned up with other things in the universe, like Dominic Raab. God and the universe don't make two. They're not the same kinds of things. It's what the philosophers would call, I suppose, a category mistake, to imagine that you could add those two together. Three persons in the Trinity doesn't mean three guys. Yeah. There's an old theological joke about the three of them Father, Son, and Holy Spirit sitting around and contemplating the dire state of humanity and saying to each other, okay, which of us is going to go then? It doesn't mean three guys, partly because, of course, God transcends arithmetic. So as Thomas Aquinas would say, three is being used here analogously. It doesn't mean three in the sense of three potatoes. We don't know in what sense it means three. It doesn't just mean nothing, and it doesn't just mean four or two, but we don't know in what sense that means three. Just as for Aquinas, God isn't loving or just or compassionate or merciful in anything like the sense that we understand those things to be, but it's the nearest language that we can use. In other words, as Aquinas remarks, when we talk about God, we don't know what we're talking about. Of that of which we cannot speak, however, it's always usually possible to say a few words, and those few poor, helpless words are known as theology. Aquinas, probably the greatest of all theologians after St. Paul, remarked of his own magnificent writings of the Summa that they were nothing but straw. He said they were straw. And he left them unfinished, maybe deliberately, maybe, we don't know, could have been deliberately, perhaps to make that point that they were straw. Persons and objects exist, of course, all kinds of things exist, but God is the reason why there's anything at all. God is the reason why anything exists at all, rather than nothing. God is the answer to the question, why does anything exist? Why is there anything rather than nothing? Some philosophers don't think that's a valid question, but I do. And the Christian doctrine of creation has to do with that, has to do with the mystery of there being something rather than nothing, rather than to do with God being some kind of celestial manufacturer, getting the world together. Thomas Aquinas, again, to refer to him, Aquinas thought the world had a beginning, that there was a creation in that sense, but he thought it was perfectly possible to believe, as his great mentor Aristotle believed, that the world had no beginning. Aquinas, the greatest theologian, thought that it was perfectly possible that the world had no beginning. Yet he believed in the doctrine of creation, because the doctrine of creation isn't really about that. It's not really about God the manufacturer. There's hardly any reference in the gospel to God as making the world. That's not necessarily to deny that he did, she did, yes, just that that's not what the doctrine is actually about. Thinking that it is one of the many mistakes made by that theologically illiterate character. What's his name again? Ditchkins. Oh, Dawkins. Yeah. I always repress his name. It's a Freudian thing with me. One of the most interesting things, the only actually about Richard Dawkins, is that his wife used to be in Doctor Who. Yeah, used to be an actor in Doctor Who. I don't know who she was or what kind of monster she might have been. Maybe he was also a monster. They dragged in. With tedious predictability, theologically illiterate scientists, not all scientists by any means are theologically illiterate, but Dawkins is, and he thinks that creation is to do with manufacture, and therefore that it's just a pseudo kind of science. Scientists have a much smarter, sophisticated version of how the universe was created, and for some reason Christians won't take that. It's not. I mean, the doctrine of creation is to do much more, for example, with the fact that creation is dependent upon God. It's dependent, and whether that had a beginning or not, that's a matter for the scientists, not a matter for theologians, we don't know. That is dependent on him in the sense that we are dependent on him. In what way? We're dependent on God for our freedom. People like Dawkins think that God is the infringement of our freedom. a limit, a law, an obstacle, an impediment, not at all. God is the reason why we can be free, why we're able to be agents, why we're able, as it were, to be ourselves. But it's also the doctrine of creation, I think, also has to do with the fact, not only, as I was saying, the fact of why, the question, why is there anything rather than nothing? Because any answer to that you might give risks being part of the something and therefore begging the question. But it also is to say that being itself is gratuitous, superfluous, might as well not have been, might easily have well not have existed. Which is to say that none of us is in the least necessary. That's not actually true about myself, but I do feel it to be true about other people. Meet here and there, that they're deluded little way, they think they're necessary, but I know that I am. Being is gift and gratuity, is gratuitousness. But if God is not a being, in the sense that a cat is a being or a chair is a being, he's not, I think, being with a big capital B, a Heideggerian being, either. The greatest French modern living French theologian has written a book called God Beyond Being. God is even beyond being, which is, of course, extremely hard, if not impossible, to grasp. The doctrine of creation for Christian orthodoxy also involves holding that being itself is good. Thomas Aquinas says goodness is fullness of being. The more being you have, the better. Whatever these things get up to, it's good that there are bananas and Brazilians and tarantulas and stamp collectors, even Justin Bieber, it's very charitable of me to acknowledge this, that Justin Bieber, it's good that he's around. These things, of course, can always have malign effects or perform malign acts, not least Justin Bieber. But what Aquinas means is that the sheer fact of them is to be affirmed. And the more being there is, the better. Whereas a certain absence of being, in this sense, not just a factual absence of being of the chair not being there, but an inability to be truly alive, is what we know as evil. An absence, a deficiency of being, a not being, a certain kind of non. There are different, as it were, kinds of non-being, but there's a particular kind of non-being, which is what people normally call evil. Anyway, more of that this evening. Come back this evening, and I'll give you hell. So it isn't quite true, I think, that God exists. Or at least it's deeply misleading to say so, and it borders upon idolatry. Of course, that's the reason why we don't want to use words. Well, we shouldn't. We want to use words like exist, because they border upon fetishizing God. A lot of the Hebrew scripture is about God's largely unavailing attempts to de-fetishize people's image. I'll say more about that in a moment. It's not quite true that God exists, and I think it certainly isn't true to believe that to believe in God is to believe that he exists. Abraham believed in God, of course, but given his cultural circumstances, there's no way in which he couldn't have believed that there was a God, but he believed in him anyway, because his belief in that sense is not propositional, is not the proposition, that there is a God exists. So to say that Abraham believed in God can't mean that he thought God existed. He would have taken that for granted. He wouldn't have been able to conceive otherwise. It means he had faith in him. He was dependent on God's love and mercy. He thought that God wouldn't leave him high and dry, and so on. So that he believed in him, not in the sense of somebody believes in the Loch Ness monster. You know, you look at all the evidence, and it's not quite complete yet, but maybe one day, one exciting morning, we'll find out if the monster exists or not. Nothing like that at all. That's again language games leading us astray. We're talking here about commitment and conviction. Yes. Now, commitment and conviction, of course, are not involved propositions. They're not anti-propositional. Evidence has to come into play. Faith has to be reasonable. You can't just say, well, I believe in something and I can't give you any reasons for it. If you say that you love somebody, you must be able to give some reasons for it. Otherwise, the words "I love you" are just an empty sound. Incidentally, of course, the words "I love you" are the oldest quotation in the world. As the various semioticians have pointed out, to say "I love you" to anybody, even if you passionately mean it, is always a quotation. You're quoting to them. And so to love somebody, it must be reasonable. There must be evidence. You must be able to say, I love her because she's incredibly rich, and I'll be able to get my hand on other reasons of that kind. And she tolerates bone-idle men, who don't lift a finger, and so on, But somebody else could say the same thing, and not in the least be in love with her. Somebody else could see those qualities in somebody. We continually see qualities in others without loving them, whereas other people see those qualities and love them, which is to say that faith, like love, is not reducible to reason. That would be rationalism, a form of rationalism. It's reducible to reason, but it's not to say it can disregard it either. In fact, I'm talking about faith and love analogously there. But faith, in a certain sense, faith is a kind of love. Kierkegaard says, you must remember that the believer is somebody in love. Kierkegaard, a man who raised Protestantism to the status of a philosophy, quite a difficult thing to do. Faith can't be reduced to reason any more than a belief in socialism, say, can be reduced to reason. But you've got to give reasons for it, nevertheless. Anyway, back to the Almighty. Quite a lot of people have what one might call a satanic idea of God. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word Satan means accuser or avenger. The word Satan is used in that sense in a number of different contexts, yes. But it's really a negative image of God himself. In the Hebrew scriptures, or in what some people rather anti-Semitically call the Old Testament, meaning all that's now done with, Satan is a certain image, very unpleasant image. Think of God, an image, for example, of God as wrathful, vengeful, judge, superego, nom du père, patriarch, big daddy. John Milton's God. Milton was an Arian. But why? And Yahweh in the Hebrew scriptures has a very hard time trying to prise people loose from this image of himself. Yes. That's the patriarch, the law, with a capital L. Why does he have a hard time? Because of many reasons, one of which is that people want to see God in that way. And why do we want to see God in that way? Because we're all chronic masochists and we like to be punished. And we want somebody to punish us. Not only do we want to be punished, but we feel we take pleasure from being punished, which means that we feel guilty about being punished, about the pleasure that we derive from it, which means that we want to be punished again. And then we start feeling pleasure from being punished again, and then we feel guilty about it. That whole syndrome, that lethal syndrome, that kind of deadlock between what Paul would call the law and desire, is what St. Paul calls sin. Basically, it's a lot to do. It doesn't exhaust what he means by sin, but it's got a lot to do with it. And that whole dispensation for Paul has been definitively set aside by the new dispensation of grace. It's not to say that for Paul, the law can just be dismissed in some naively libertarian way. The law has its needs and uses, and particularly for beginners, like a grammar book, like a book of learning a foreign language. But there's no salvation in it, Paul says. There is no salvation in the law. Yeah. The law will tell you where you've gone wrong, and it will scourge you for doing so, but it will never, in its cruelty, the law won't tell you how to go right. Like Freud's image of the superego, the law is barbarous, cruel, and vindictive, and also wildly out of control, which I suppose is what Jacques Derrida meant when he once said in a seminar that the law was mad. He thought the law was mad. Why is the law mad? Well, because, for example, it demands of us more than it knows we can give. It's unreasonable. It has to be kind of reined in. But if you want to be punished, then you might as well have a God, who's a sort of tough guy. It might as well have a big nasty bastard of a deity, who will clobber you, kick you up the backside, rather than some spineless, limp-wristed, guardian reading type of God, who will let you off the hook. What's the point of having a God like that? You're going to have a God, you might as well have a real bastard. As I said before, Yahweh spends quite a lot of time, so we're told, trying to persuade his pathologically religious people. I mean, the Jews of the Hebrew Scriptures are pathologically religious. They want this God, and they want to make sacrifices to him, build places to him, special places, special times, and all this is called religion. But he's trying to persuade them that he's not a satanic God at all. They've got him wrong. Not only isn't he satanic, but he isn't even a religious God, in the sense in which, say Zeus or Vishnu is God. What he wants is not cult and ritual, sacrifice, burnt offerings to placate his wrath, because he doesn't have any wrath. He wants mercy and justice. And one of the prophets famously makes him say, I hate your burnt offerings, your sacrifices stink in my nostrils, your incense, I think it is, stinks in my nostrils. What are you doing about caring for the poor, for the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, the usual, almost kind of cliche stuff in a way in the Hebrew Scriptures? And to counter this satanic image of himself, Yahweh gives his people an alternative image, which is, if you like, his own idea of himself, which is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the opposite to the satanic image of God. And one of the things that Jesus teaches, if we're to believe, what's said in the Scriptures, is that, quite outrageously, scandalously, he teaches that those who fall outside the law, outside the Judaic law, either people who are permanently outside it, like Gentiles, or Jews who happen, because of their sinfulness, to be outside it, like sex workers, Mary Magdalene, or sinners generally, dropouts of those kinds. He actually argues that they will enter the kingdom of heaven before the pious, respectable folk who meticulously observe the law. So Jesus is the Word. To say that Jesus is the Word of God, a phrase, of course, that St. John famously uses, means that God is present in Jesus as the meaning is present in the Word. The Father is present in the Son as the meaning is present in the Word. And the meaning is present in a word, not, of course, as ink is present in a bottle, or Guinness, or whatever it is, but in the activity of the word. Back to Wittgenstein, it is the way a word behaves in a form of life, which is its meaning. Yes. And similarly, if you apply that theologically, then it's the activity of Jesus Christ, it's his life, death, resurrection. It's a narrative, it's a story that is the meaning of Yahweh, not some set of doctrines, propositions, laws. They may be involved. You may need those things every now and then. You may need obligations and prohibitions. The whole, Kantian notion of ethics, but they only make sense within a wider context in which what's at stake isn't just obeying obligations, but is happiness, well-being, fulfillment, whatever rather inadequate words one wants to use about it. So this is a God who isn't respectable at all, however much the churches may have tried to gentrify him. If you want to know what Yahweh looks like, then you have to take a look at a human life which ends in apparent utter failure. A homeless, vagrant, celibate, propertyless, unemployed, first century Palestinian prophet who spoke up for justice, and for doing so was done to death by the imperial state. There's your religious consolation for you. There's your pie in the sky. The whole idea of religion as some sort of consolation for all the terrible things we have to suffer in life. Well, that's questioned by the crucifixion. Not only was he killed, of course, he murdered. It was not only was God murdered in that most scandalous and inconceivable idea, that right at the centre of the Christian gospel is this lunatic idea that God comes to save us, and what do? We murder him. I mean, it's certainly original, not usually the way you treat God, murder him. And not only murder him, but kill him, submit him to that peculiarly mocking, humiliating, excruciating, word excruciating, of course, comes from cross, kind of punishment, which was reserved by the Romans almost entirely for absconding slaves and political insurrectionists. Maybe the Romans thought he was a political insurrectionist, or maybe, perhaps more likely, they liked it to be thought that he thought that, because it gave them an excuse for doing away with him. I don't know whether he was or not. So if you want an image of God, you have to look at a broken body cross. Then you realize that that's an image of humanity as well, inseparably. You mustn't make graven images of Yahweh. Why not? Because of the law against, it's a law, as I said before, against fetishism. The only image of Yahweh is flesh and blood, is people, is human beings, particularly one human being. Christians, like Jews, one of the ways that they manifest their faith is by keeping the Sabbath holy, which doesn't, of course, mean going to church. There weren't any churches in the days when this order was issued. It means idleness, indolence, not doing any work, just hanging out. The commandment to keep the Sabbath holy is about leisure. It's a momentary respite from the curse of labor. Holy days are, of course, holidays, festive liberations from the treadmill of temporality, when you can take time out and you can be your own boss. And these days, these are called holy days. These days of just, lying in bed all day and being holy, by doing so. These days are called holy because they are fleeting images of how God is all the time, because God lives like that all the time. God is on permanent sabbatical leave. In fact, used to be said of me when I was professor at Oxford, since I travelled abroad quite a lot, I was known in some circles as the Heathrow professor of English. In fact, God seems not to have lifted a finger since the creation, apart from the deeply embarrassing business of sending his child to redeem us, only to see him strung up in a farce so black, a kind of blackly farcical moment. It beggars understanding. Seems strung up by the colonial powers, by Rome, by the greater imperial power in the ancient world, but probably, we don't know, but probably at the behest of a committee of extremely religious, God-fearing, respectable people, called the Sanhedrin, the Judaic governing caste. Because God doesn't do a tap, because he doesn't lift a finger, he's a critique of productivity, that great fetish, which is to say that eternal life, as the scriptures called it, is, among other things, a critique of instrumental reason. We have to do this X because of Y. So God exists, if you can say, he exists purely for his own self-delight. And to say that the world is his creation is to say that it too exists for just the same reason. The world, too, has no point whatsoever. That's one reason why it might well have not happened. It exists for its own self-delight, for no practical reason. There's no practical telos end. And in that sense, you might say that the act of creation is aesthetic, because what creation most resembles is a work of art which contains its goals and grounds and ends, etc. Anyway, the good news is that you don't need to do anything in heaven at all. You can just forget about having to do anything. Some people think that's because you'll be a spirit, and it's hard to see spirits, mowing the lawn, or taking the garbage out or something. Speaking of which, it can't be true. It can't be true, can it? It can't be literally true that God is omnipotent. Once again, we don't know what we're talking about, basically, in the sense of being able to do anything. There are lots and lots of things God can't do. He can't brush his teeth. He can't comb his hair. He can't fasten his shoelaces. Millions of things. No, it's not because you'll be a spirit that you won't need to do anything in heaven. Because, at least for the Christian faith, you won't be a spirit in heaven. That's because, of course, what it is for you to be you, as Aquinas again would argue, is a fleshly, corporeal affair. It's a matter of having or being a body. It's a very interesting hesitation there, whether it's more accurate to say that we have bodies or that we are bodies. There's a creative ambiguity there. There are times when it's, of course, we talk about, using our bodies, having them as a possession, but at the same time being very wary of the kind of dualism which says, well, what is it that's having the body? Is it some kind of invisible soul? Soul or spirit for Aquinas is a generic term. It means the kind of activity proper to a particular species. So tortoises have souls, strange though it may seem. You may not just look at a tortoise and think, it's got a soul. But actually, the truth is, tortoises have souls. The word soul just describes a certain form of species life, and the word, when it's applied to human beings, That's the same kind of thing. But what individuates us is our bodies, is a particular parcel of flesh. You know, there is no other parcel of flesh that's you. Some parcels are bigger than others, as we know. It's a different story, which I will pass over quickly. I mean, Aquinas would probably have thought that the soul of Michael Jackson, or the spirit of Michael Jackson, survived his death. Aquinas would probably have thought that, but he would certainly not have thought that that was Michael Jackson. He wouldn't have thought that the soul of Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson, because what it is to be somebody, a human being, is to be embodied. In other words, the Christian belief tradition is not in the immortality of the soul, it's essentially a Platonic idea, but in the resurrection of the body, the transfiguration of the body, not only, of course, of the body, but actually that transfiguration of the earth itself, which is sometimes called the New Jerusalem. If heaven is anywhere, it's not in the skies, it's in the future. And to have faith is to belong in some shadowy way already to the future. That history is in some sense outmoded. In an age of climate catastrophe, I think we can appreciate this, the urgency. The dominant tone of the gospel is one of urgency. You know, it's wrapping up fast, and you better wake up and see it. Yeah, and it's easier in a sense to understand that tone. It's much more convincing, at least, you know, in our own political and social situation. You have to submit to what St. John calls the world, which is a very dark kind of phrase in John. It means something like the power setup. It doesn't mean creation. Creation is good because it's God's, but it means, you know, the Romans basically as well, that kind of stuff. You have to submit that, the present, to the judgment of the future. You have to bring to bear upon a present which is already passing away, the judgment of a future that's to come. And to speak of heaven as a new earth, as sometimes is done, is to say that Christianity is a form of materialism, which is one of the several ways in which it's not, I think, a religion. More of that in a moment. Religions tend to believe, don't they, that the spiritual is inner, is higher, and is basically individual. Christianity rejects. I'll say more about that in a minute. I mean, spirituality consists in activities like, you know, fighting for a just wage, for example, which are neither inner nor higher, nor particularly individual. The New Testament tends not. The New Testament is an anti-Semitic term. Sorry, the Gospels tend not to think in terms in that way of individuals, whatever, you know, the Tories might think Christianity is about. I began this talk by being a little wary about the idea of eternal life, saying that it was slightly kind of daunting, mildly alarming. And some people might feel that way because they might think that even eternal bliss will become boring in the end. But that's because they're mistaking the idea of eternity for the idea of perpetuity. Yes, it's a mistake we make a lot. Eternity means out of time, not endless time. There's no time to be bored in heaven because there's no time. If you could pluck the dream, the fantasy of modernism, could pluck a particular moment out of the dull sequence of moments, it would be eternal. If you could bite the moment to the core, as Edward Thomas says, you would find that it was eternal. But one shouldn't be wary of heaven, as I was to begin with. If one recalls Jesus' words in the Gospel that he says he's come to us so that we should have life and have it more abundantly. Abundance of life. Heaven is, which is to say, heaven, the fathomless abyss of love, which is the life of God. In other words, far from being boring, it's ecstatic and overflowing, superabundant. It's pure jouissance, utter delight, the most unbelievable fun, a permanent rave, a never-ending blast, a matter of being wildly, deliriously in love, while also being infinitely secure in the knowledge that you are loved yourself, utterly without condition, because God is totally besotted with human beings. God knows why. Let's look around. In fact, one of the most convincing reasons for God's non-existence, far more persuasive than all the kind of Dawkins stuff, is that if there is a God, he must be hopelessly in love with Donald Trump. Come on, is there any better reason for rejecting the whole idea at all? He must also, I imagine, surely have a boundless sense of humour. So, he must have a boundless sense of humour. I mean, he needs it, but whether he needs it or not, he must. I think it follows from the notion of abundance of life. And therefore, the best image of him is not an old codger with a white beard, but a kind of cosmic belly laugh. That inconceivable sense that despite all appearances contrary, all is ultimately well. That despite everything that one sees, knows, hears, thinks, even so, in the end, all is well. If religion has a role to play, it may be in that kind of insight, which is sometimes known as insight of a mystic. Mysticism, by the way, which I won't say, I don't know very much about it anyway, but I won't pretend I do. But there is mysticism is a kind of sub-branch of theology, I think, which is about the actual experience of God. That's not central. That's not central at all to the scriptures, but there is a tradition, an interesting tradition, which is of what it is like to experience God. But we must beware, perhaps, because we live in a certain society, in a postmodern world, which fetishizes experience all the time. I live on the near the north coast of Ireland, near the Giant's Causeway, the Giant's Causeway. And nowadays, although I've been there umpteen times, that's the worst thing about living near a UNESCO special, what do you call it, science. You have to take people there all the time. You have a guest. You have to say, have you seen the Giant's Causeway? No, they say. You crow. This has happened to me like in Egypt, They say, you've seen the pyramids, haven't you? Maybe the Siam Relief, the Great Wall of China. Anyway, nowadays you can go to the Giant's Causeway and you can not only walk around the Giant's Causeway, you can have the Giant's Causeway experience. Well, don't you feel sorry for all those millions of people who came and went, poor souls with their cameras, and they never had the experience. They only started in about 10 years ago or something. Anyway, so if you think of heaven as most unbelievable fun, a blast and a rave and all that, and delirious happiness and love, which it must be, then there's no reason to be alarmed about that. Speaking of God as an old codger with a white beard, as I did a moment ago, I once saw a cartoon of God like that, an old man with a white beard in a kind of white smock. But instead of feet, he had an axle through the ends of his legs and two wheels. And the caption was, God moves in a mysterious way. So anyway, I come finally to the question which you've all been impatiently waiting for after all of this stuff. If there is a heaven, how do you get there? That's the question we want to ask. Well, there are two answers, really. There are two answers, I think. The first is the religious answer. I mean here by religion, the belief that by performing certain rites and observing certain decrees, you can make contact with a supreme being. You perhaps can appropriate some of his power, placate the wrath that might otherwise consign you to damnation, and win your way to salvation. That's a religious idea, and it often comes with certain other ideas tied to its tail. For example, the idea that humanity is corrupt to its core, that God is offended by our wrongdoing and punishes us by sending us to hell, that the material world is to be spurned, that the spiritual, as I've said already, consists in some inner, essentially higher and individual realm, that suffering is to be embraced, that sexuality is to be shunned, and so on. Okay? Now, what's revolutionary, I think, about Christianity, I don't use the word just in the slap-happy way that it often is used, is it rejects every one of those propositions, all the way from performing certain rites and so on, all the way through to the shunning of sexuality. And I think insofar as it does reject them, it's hard, it's misleading to call it a religion at all. Christian answer to how to get to heaven. The second answer is, of course, much more material and mundane. And if you approach me privately after the lecture and have £10, something a very modest amount of money, clasped in your palm, I will let you know what it is. So you know already. I've said it already. You'll get there by feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, welcoming the immigrant, and all this very traditional cliched stuff almost. In the words of Mary in Luke's Gospel, you'll know who Yahweh is when you see the poor being filled with good things and the rich being sent empty away. And that revolutionary reversal is, as I say, almost a cliche of the Hebrew prophecies and scriptures, that you know that Yahweh is near when you see things being violently turned upside down. Yeah. That's not to say, of course, that cult Christianity doesn't continue to exist. It does. Baptism, Eucharistic assembly, but this in itself won't save you any more than the law will. It exists in relation to, in transformative relation to the world itself. And in the end, of course, Christianity will wither away. Religion will come to an end. There will be no temple in the New Jerusalem, as the Book of Apocalypse says, because there will be no need for any temple. Religion is a transitory affair. So, to conclude, getting to heaven is really pretty simple. As the Beatles said, all you need is love. But all you need is love is not so much mistaken as misleading. Sounds like, all you need is a bucket and a spade or something. Whereas in fact, it's more like, all you need to do is to abseil down Mount Kilimanjaro. Because, of course, love, in the gospel sense of the term, caritas or agape, is an exhausting, often unpleasant, sometimes almost impossibly difficult labor. And perhaps in the end, perhaps this is the meaning of faith, in the end beyond our power. However much we can accomplish, perhaps in the end, beyond our power. There's also the question, which is for a different talk, and I won't go into it too much, the question of what counts as love, this little word that slips off our tongue so easily. What counts as love? Ethics is the science of what it is to live well, and is a permanent and unending conflict and contention, conversation over that topic. What is it to live well? Which is a conversation been going on since Aristotle, and before that. Ethics is the science of happiness, of fulfillment, what it is to live well, just as psychoanalysis is the science of unhappiness. So there's the question, the extremely vexed question of what counts as love anyway. And again, an answer you might see given by the gospel is again a narrative, is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That counts as love. It's not a set of propositions, it's not an image, it's an activity. It's a set of activities. But we can avoid the difficulties of that by continuing as we do to think of love primarily as personal, romantic, sexual, erotic. In other words, falling into the distinctively modern trap, the very unancient way of thinking for which love is first of all, a sentiment rather than a social practice. Whereas agape for the New Testament need have nothing to do with feeling at all. It doesn't matter how you feel as long as you do, whatever it is that you're enjoined to do. Perhaps this is one reason why you won't hear very much about Christianity on a literary or cultural studies course, whereas you'll hear a great deal about sexual and erotic love, but very little about the kind of love that can get you crucified, which in the end is the kind, I think, that counts. And on that joyous and upbeat note, we can talk about